Welcome to viewers around the world. We're here today thanks to International Crisis Group with an excellent lineup of experts to discuss Myanmar's 2020 elections taking place on November the 8th, aptly titled Path to Stability or Flashpoint for Conflict. I'm Gwen Robinson, editor-at-large of Nikkei Asian Review, and I'll introduce our speakers in a minute. Just to fill you in or update you and remind you, we're talking about the circumstances surrounding this very controversial election coming up in Myanmar, where the de facto leader Aung San Suu Kyi and her National League for Democracy seem set to win a second five-year term. A crucial democratic test will be whether the poll can convince the country's minorities they're getting fair representation or see more internal conflict. At the same time, as we've all read in horror, Myanmar is battling a very vicious second wave of COVID-19. There are many issues there, which we'll turn to very shortly. But first, to introduce our speakers, we have Richard Horsey, Crisis Group's Myanmar Senior Advisor and former Myanmar representative of the International Labour Organization. Ei Toe Lwin, Chief Election Correspondent at Frontier Myanmar, an online and weekly journal, and formerly a journalist with the Myanmar Times, whose reporting on Myanmar political affairs has been widely followed for the past decade. And last but not least, we have Jonas Gahr Støre, leader of the main opposition Labour Party in Norway, former Foreign Minister of Norway, and a crisis group. To briefly explain the format today, we'll hear from our speakers, then have a short discussion before opening for a Q&A session in about half an hour. Everyone is welcome to ask questions, but if you'd like to ask a question, please just type in the Q&A box on Zoom, stating your name and affiliation. We'll try to get to all questions, but apologies in advance if we run out of time. And to remind you, this session will be recorded and it's live streamed on Facebook. So before we begin the discussion, I'd just like to turn over to Richard Horsey, who's just authored an excellent report for Crisis Group on the election and is now sitting in the middle of Yangon, I presume still under lockdown, Richard, with a few thoughts on the situation.
Thanks very much, Gwen, and hello, everyone. The first thing I'd like to say about these elections in Myanmar on the 10th of November is that these are only the second democratic elections in Myanmar since 1960. So these are a really big deal. And it's important to remember that these are very significant, particularly in a part of the world where, not to name any names, but electoral democracy is not exactly going from strength to strength. Now, it's become very clear over the last 5 years in Myanmar that elections won't solve some of the country's most difficult challenges. The Rohingya crisis, the civil conflict, which has been raging for decades, the illicit economy. But I don't think anyone feels that those huge challenges would be better served or better resolved by a country with less democracy and without elections. So these elections are very significant. There's not much suspense in these elections. The outcome is not very much in doubt. It seems very likely that there will be another 5-year term for Aung San Suu Kyi and her NLD, and that there will be people who are unhappy with that outcome, but that outcome will not be challenged outside of the framework of the law. So that is quite significant also. And it comes, this predictability in a sense, comes despite some very unpredictable dynamics in Myanmar at the moment, and particularly the surge over the last 6 weeks or so in coronavirus cases that Gwen referred to, and an economic crisis that has been brought on by the lockdowns and general economic climate as a result of COVID. But just because the outcome is not very much in doubt, just because the result will probably look fairly similar to the elections last time in 2015. This doesn't mean that the consequences will be the same, very far from it. 2015 was a moment of unity. It was a moment where the country came together and looked forward to a new future under a democratically elected government. And even those people who weren't strong supporters of the NLD, different ethnic minority communities, some in opposition, nevertheless, most people felt that this was a moment of hope for the country and moving forward. This time, the same results or similar results are going to produce division rather than unity. And I'd like to spend a couple of minutes explaining why that is. Myanmar has a British-style first past the post electoral system. And I don't want to get into a philosophical discussion about the merits of various electoral systems, but just to say that first past the post is particularly ill-suited to the particular conditions of Myanmar, a country that has huge diversity of communities, large number of minorities, and where the state building process is incomplete. That is, that many of those minorities do not yet feel that they have been accorded a proper place in the Union of Myanmar, and that the initial challenges at the moment of independence 7 decades ago have not yet been resolved. And one of the things that we know about elections is that they create winners and losers. And this particular electoral system will amplify majority victory, NLD victory, at the expense of others, particularly minority communities who will feel that this electoral system marginalizes them in parliamentary and political terms. And of course, the Rohingya have been disenfranchised already before 2015 and will not be part really of this election at all. So the 2015 election went ahead with the same, same electoral system. So why so much difference in the approach of minority communities? Well, in 2015, it wasn't that minority communities thought that they could do well in purely terms of seats. It wasn't that they thought that they could win the election or carve out significant leverage. It was that they felt that they had an ally in the NLD, that by working together with the NLD, either in some form of coalition or by pushing in the same direction and working together on solving the country's problems, that they would have genuine input into their political futures. So in 2015, part of this moment of hope was that minority communities saw the NLD as a likely ally. Fast forward to 2020, and most ethnic minority communities, their leaders, their political representatives see the NLD as an adversary, not as an ally. And this was underlined last week when the Election Commission announced cancellations in elections in different parts of the country, either because some areas were under the control of opposition armed groups, the electoral authorities couldn't get there to compile voter lists, or because of conflict, which meant holding elections would be unsafe. Those were the criteria used by the Election Commission to determine cancellations, but unfortunately this process is very untransparent. There was no detailed rationale given for the decisions, and many ethnic communities were surprised, even shocked, by the extent of cancellations in places that they claim were safe and stable and where elections could have been held. And they saw many of the cancellation decisions as deliberate gerrymandering by the government to improve the chances of the NLD in those areas. Whether that is true or not, it is the strongly held perception. And what is also pretty clear is that the Election Commission is not a truly independent body. And so that puts it in a difficult position for the Election Commission to try to claim that it did make these decisions on purely fair and objective grounds. And that was made even more difficult by some of the areas where the Election Commission did not go ahead. in a number of NLD strongholds in conflict-affected areas, sometimes the most conflict-affected areas in the country, elections are so far going ahead. And that's reinforced this feeling that this was about gerrymandering, not about safety. The other aspect of these elections that skews the results is the constitution itself, which mandates 25% of the seats in all national and regional parliamentary bodies are held by serving military officers appointed by the commander-in-chief. And since the military is a Burman, majoritarian dominated institution, that also skews things away from minority representation. So it's very clear what is needed in the eyes of those who are losers in this electoral system. They want to see constitutional reform and they want to see electoral system reform. Unfortunately, neither of those is likely. The Myanmar military has a veto on constitutional reform that it has deployed even recently, so constitutional change appears out of reach for the near future. The NLD, on the other hand, is not interested in electoral system reform. And why would it be? It's served extremely well by the current first past the post system. So either way, both of those reforms are likely to be blocked. Now, what this means is that if minority communities start to see that the path of electoral democracy is not one that will allow them to achieve their aspirations and objectives, they are likely to revert to different means. And if the political door, the electoral door is closing, another door is always open in Myanmar, and that is the door of insurrection and direct action. So I do think we have to be very worried that these elections could sow greater division, create more losers or perceived losers, and carry a significant risk of amplifying, exacerbating armed conflict in Myanmar in the months and years ahead. So what can be done about this? If the constitution can't be changed and if electoral system reform is out of reach, there is nevertheless something very important that the NLD can do that is not prohibited by the constitution. And that would be to treat ethnic communities, ethnic political parties as partners in a nation building and peaceful future rather than as electoral adversaries. That has not been the case up till now, but it would be a move that would have enormous significance that could change the political dynamics in the country. And it's a move that is within the gift of the NLD. Thanks very much.
Well, Richard, that on that happy note, I think you've effectively answered about half questions, but there is plenty more to address. So I'd like to turn to Ei and Jonas, maybe to kick off with a general question, which also you might have some thoughts on this too, Richard. But let's just say, I think the top line issue is really about credibility of this poll, no matter what all these things you say on the negative and positive sides about any election might be better than none to pursue this sort of somewhat skewed democratic path of a democratic system. But given the suspensions in various constituencies of voting around the country and the reservations expressed by international and domestic experts, including the UN's own, special envoy on Myanmar, to what extent can this election be credible at all? Perhaps, Ei, you could address that first.
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gwyn. Yes, cancellation of election in some area across the country became the biggest issue in Myanmar because the decision could disenfranchise 1.5 million of 38 million eligible voters in Myanmar. And then more than 1.2 million people in conflict area Rakhine State lost to exercise their right to vote. Because of the decision, through criticism by the political party and because UEC failed to consult with the political parties in making the decision, and there was no specific explanation with the announcement. And then, so political party said because they checked the 2015 general election result, those areas won by the ethnic party, not NND. That's why they said, so the UEC, the Union Election Body, intentionally decided not to hold election in those areas. But UEC said, so they made the decision based on the recommendation of the military. But so UEC did not explain much about the situation. But so we got some more information at the press conference, which called October 24, the military press conference. They said like, yes, so those of the cancellation area based on the recommendation of the military, but so the constituency Palawa in Chin State, so they recommended not to hold election in those areas. But so this constituency, Palawa, not included in the cancellation list of the UEC. But military agreed to provide security if UEC want to hold election in those areas. And another reason is ethnic party said some area are possible to hold election because though there is no serious fighting is happening there. But as my experience, it's obvious to say that area to be safe, even there is no fighting there. According to the military explanation, the constituency in Maingan, township in Shan State, so this area under the control of the Shan ethnic group, RCSS, control area. And so during the election campaign period, officials from ethnic group, they asked head of the local villagers not to allow any election campaign in the village, and non-Shan candidate of non-Shan ethnic party, they not allowed to get into the village for their campaign, and a man was shot by the army also in September. Because of this condition, the military suggested not to hold election in this area. I think that kind of situation.
But maybe you could address that, step back a little bit with all of these things and yes, tell us whether you think this is actually harming the basic credibility of the elections in the eyes of not just in ethnic areas, but also in Burma-dominated areas. Do you think overall this is hurting the image of the elections and people's faith in it? I read that many people won't vote this time. What's your impression?
Yeah. So this is one of the issue, and cancellation of election in ethnic area. That is one of the issue. The political party criticized the commission management of the election. The commission drew criticism over flawed voter list, the lack of transparent dialogue between political parties, civil society, and media, and also removing some important rights to be observed by the election observation group, and censorship of political party speech in free airtime slot on state media. And also other political party, they face some kind of restriction and they cannot do campaign freely because of the COVID-19 restriction. So that they can.
So do you get the impression that voters are not going to turn out in the numbers they did last time?
Yes. So because of due to that circumstance, so most of the people are saying that the election could not be free and fair. And for me, like it is hard to say how the election will be free for all and how the public will be safe from the threat of COVID-19. There are so many things happening in Myanmar.
Right, so let's return to some of those issues you raised. I am interested in the voter turnout question because it was huge last time, and as Richard said, it was a great moment of unity and hope. But this time, I don't think people, not only if you've got elections that aren't very credible in people's eyes already, but they have to brave COVID-19 in order to go and cast their vote. It might really deter people. But let's turn to Jonas. You know, as we've heard, concerns are very widespread in the international community as well about the conduct and credibility of these elections. But it's also extremely clear, I think, that there's still a very strong desire in Western capitals, at least, to support Myanmar's fledgling democracy, and for want of, you know, alternatives to continue the kind of aid and assistance that the NLD-led government has had from, particularly from Europe and America and other major countries. What's the perspective from the international viewpoint, particularly from Europe, you know, given all that, and also given, I think, particularly in Europe, the attention paid to the case at the International Court of Justice against Myanmar's alleged genocide of Rohingya is also reverberating quite strongly. Sorry, that's a bit of a messy question.
Well, thank you, Gwen, and thank you for this excellent debate and for the introduction on the paper that Richard wrote. And of course, it's with some humiliation and admiration that I listened to Ei Toe Lwin, who sits on the inside experiencing that very close on. But I would like to, you know, as you say, and you asked me the question, to lift the perspective seen from geographically far away and go 10 years back in time. When I was foreign minister from 2005 till 2012, I mean, we went through a complete change in how we approached Burma, Myanmar. Norway, actually, after the cyclone in 2008, decided to engage quite actively through the humanitarian track to get in touch with authorities on the side in Myanmar to get dialogue tracks started up. So we did that in 2008, 9, and 10 with great obstacles and great opposition, because there was a strong mobilization also in my country for the human rights situation and against the authoritarian rule of the military in Myanmar. And then came the changes, and I was, as the first foreign minister, going into Myanmar in January 2012 with the hope that we were now seeing in Asia, in this region, perhaps a real transformation, which came. Remember, this was after the Arab Spring. This was in a moment where democracy was gaining ground. And then we've been through the years since 2015, when elections came about. And I think that the broad picture still is that Myanmar has taken huge steps away from what really was the picture from the 60s until democratic reform came about. And if you look at the region as a whole and the neighborhood, still it is a story which has, I think, the expectation that we are still within the, what shall I say, the realm of hoping what democracy can deliver. Yes, there are hurdles. Yes, there is this extraordinary human rights situation with the Rohingyas, which I think should concern also governments from Europe a lot more than it does at the moment. But I still think that these elections will be seen and interpreted as being still, with its with their shortcomings, democratic elections. And first by the post, well, I mean, it is a system that is used by the oldest democracies on the globe. It is not a very not representative system when you have great diversity, but in Europe you will have a history that in a way sums up that if you have two proportional system, you lose control, and we've seen that also back in the history. So, in my view, I would address it the following way. These elections will take place. They will give the result that I think Richard describes quite clearly. And the question is then, what can then facilitate constitutional reform in the years to come? What can be done from the outside to support cajole, put pressure on government and the ruling party in Myanmar to go in that direction. And without reform and with deteriorating human rights situation and violations, what should be the international community's response? I think there is a great reluctance to go back to where we were before 2010, 11, 12, starting a new debate about sanctions. And what I think the West, if we can use that expression, should think very thoroughly through the dilemmas facing us if we now embark on a policy of isolation, of pressure, of cutting ties, in a situation where we can still influence and be part of something which can improve the internal situation. I think the dilemmas linked to the isolation in leading up to 2010, 11, 12 still are there, and that is why, but the international community is a diverse actor here. Let me put it that way. From China in the region, the neighbors of Myanmar, and on to Europe, where there is not a single voice speaking out. So these elections will be taken as elections, as I see it. And the big question is, how do we stay engaged, influence, and forward these positions with the ruling parties of Myanmar after the elections?
Well, yes, indeed. I mean, that might be, you've just asked your own question. I mean, I wonder if you've got an answer to that.
Well, I still believe that the policy of engagement is the right one, because there are so many important. Myanmar, we should not forget, is still in its very early phase of walking down the lane of democracy. All democracies take shape from their own history. This first party through the post, it has a British legacy. Then it is a country of extreme diversity, more diverse than any European country. And let me just put it this way: I think the value of what the crisis group is doing here and what Richard is communicating is that it is bringing some sober evaluation to how to read Myanmar to the West, which has been too much, in a way, shaped by images. I mean, I come from a country that where the Nobel Committee awarded the Peace Prize to Aung San Suu Kyi. And now people are really, asking what kind of research was behind that decision, given what has happened since 2015. So, it is a very complex country to understand, which to me brings, the instinct of being a bit cautious about drawing intense conclusions, and still believing that a policy of engagement, close engagement, both from the economic and political side from the international community, is the right way to go.
Thank you very much. Before we turn to some questions that are very interesting questions coming in from viewers, I'd just like to check, since I think, as mentioned, I think one key to the perception of credibility, at least in the eyes of the population, and also to some extent the international community, is the voter turnout. If it's abysmally low, I think that is a further hit to credibility. Richard, what's your take so far on indications of voter turnout amidst this terrible, COVID second wave and all the other disincentives? I don't know what the very latest is also on the issue of violence in ethnic areas, but what's your sense of voter turnout?
Sure. It's hard to predict. I think it would be difficult to see the same heights, 80% turnout or whatever the precise number was in 2015. I think it'd be hard to imagine better than that. The question is, how much worse will it be? On the one hand, people may be nervous to go out and vote, for an election where the outcome is not that unclear, especially in the center of the country where the NLD is really dominant. People may feel that their vote doesn't count that much. We see this in many democratic countries also. Against that, they still want to show their support for their preferred candidates. There's still a novelty to elections in Myanmar. It's still a sense of, we didn't have this for most of all of our lives. So let's, recognize this moment. Everyone wants to get a selfie on Instagram on Facebook mainly, with their finger with the purple ink at the end of the electoral process. And don't forget, people have been locked down, not quite a full lockdown, but a quite strict lockdown in much of the country, Yangon especially. This is a chance to legally go out of your house, maybe bump into some friends, share a bit of gossip. I mean, people may seize this opportunity to get out of their houses as well. So I don't think we can predict a calamitous drop in turnout, but I think there are big questions there.
Interesting. Ei, what's your, as a reporter on the ground and with a network of reporters there, what's your sense of what the turnout is likely to be?
I think, yeah, I'm not quite sure the voter turnout will be low because of the current situation. Many people many people are joining on a bid rally and so a bid gathering election campaign, also in Yangon, and so that I think the election turnout will not be low, and so people they will go out and vote for the party of their choice. Yeah.
Right. Okay, so you think it will be low, possibly?
A little bit, not much, yeah.
A little bit low, okay. Look, there's so many good questions coming in. I'd like to turn to those. Maybe start with one from Chansu Baran of the Turkish Embassy in Myanmar, who asks whether anyone can explain how the number of seats in Parliament would be affected by the cancellations, which I think is an excellent question because I'm still not absolutely clear how many constituencies are actually cancelled. What does that mean for the next Parliament? Richard, you're an election geek. I'm sure you've studied this.
So there are 22 constituencies in the national parliament that will see no voting. Those seats will be empty.
That's out of how many? And that's in the lower house?
Yeah, no, that's the whole national parliament, the upper house and the lower house, 22 seats. That's quite a small number compared to the total. There are 498 seats in total elected and another 168 military appointees. So we're talking about a 664 seat union parliament with 22 seats cancelled. So it's clearly not going to move the needle significantly, but in almost none of these cancelled seats was the NLD likely to win. So you've removed 22 opponents from the NLD. So it's reduced by about 11 seats, the number of seats the NLD needs to win in order to have an outright majority.
That's very interesting. And are any of them in urban areas or are these all rural?
So constituencies always contain an urban and a rural component. So yes, these are towns. If it's cancellations, these are towns with rural areas as well. It's a different picture in the subnational state and region parliaments. If you look at somewhere like Rakhine State, most seats have been cancelled. The majority is now likely to be an NLD and military bloc. And on Rakhine State, the Rakhine people feel that the NLD and the military are a bloc, even if the military and the NLD may not see it that way. So big impact at a subnational level, small impact at a national level, very big political impact.
Right, and presumably quite a lot of people who are going to be angry about not having a vote. And I presume it's also knocked out all these internally displaced people as well, right? That's added maybe 250,000.
So there's about 1.6 million voters, 1.5, something like that, as Ei said earlier, who won't now have a chance to vote. And then, of course, there are many who never made it onto the electoral roll in the first place. Right. The Rohingya, people in Wa area, which the Election Commission can't go, and so on.
Right. Okay, thank you very much for that. We've got a question from Toshi Kudo, Director of GMI from Japan, who asks, what are the political goals of ethnic minorities actually in concrete terms of either the parties themselves or the ethnic armed organizations? Would either of you like to answer that? I mean, Ei, I presume you've done, well, Frontier has done some good reports on ethnic areas. What is your impression of what the political goals are of the ethnic minorities?
I don't know exactly about their goals of the political party. But so when I interview with them, they want to in the brief. So their idea is quite different from 2015, because 2015 election, so ethnic nationality, they voted for the NND party, because so they have high hope NND will bring internal peace and also the development of the region. But within 5 years, they understand that so they should not be relying on other party to do for themselves. That's why they want to do themselves, and they want to rely themselves. So that's why in this election they said they want to vote for the ethnic party, and also ethnic group. They are pushing ethnic nationality to vote for the ethnic party. So that I think so they want to rely on themselves to do for the development of the region and for the peace process, rather than relying on NND party.
Right. And Richard, what's your take after your study of some of these key ethnic areas, including the EAO, the ethnic armed organisations, as well as the parties, in terms of their actual concrete political goals?
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree with what Ei said. I think if we go beyond politics and look at the communities and what they want to be treated as equals in a union, not as second-class citizens. That's their overwhelming desire. And, you know, they are referred to as minorities because they have smaller population, but they don't see themselves as minorities. They're the majority in their areas. They see themselves as nationals of a different group in a different area, which volunteered to join the country at independence, and they've never got the equality that they were promised. So that's what it's all about. You know, they often phrase it in terms of federalism, to also touch on another question that's been asked. They frame it in terms of federalism, but federalism is an idea, not a specific proposal for the future. It's an idea of equality. It's an idea of, you know, equal states, but federalism will be very hard to bring into practice. It requires constitutional change. It requires a different political pact between the minorities and the majority. And fundamentally, it requires resolving issues at the subnational level. How will the Shan in Kachin state feel if federalism gives the power to the Kachin? There's a lot of complexity that hasn't been thought about.
Right. Again, this comes.
Oh, sorry. Asking to come in on that.
Yes, I know. Yeah, this comes back to the issue of constitutional reform. I was going to ask you, Jonas, whether you think, given how critical these questions, including electoral reform and the constitutional issue, and which relates to things like this, you know, deep-seated problem of ethnic representation as well, do outside actors have any leverage or legitimacy on these questions? If, for example, you argue that the West should stay very engaged, but perhaps they should extract more leverage over to target specific priorities.
Well, I think that's a good question, and I would actually like to ask Richard from the inside to comment on that. You know, what is the role and potential of let me say broadly, the international community, if that actor exists? I mean, that's a very diverse description. You know, China, neighbors in the region, ranging out to the UN, Europe, and other actors. I remember, you know, in the first phase, when the military, before the elections, when the military opened up for reform, my experience was that they were very selective in inviting in external skills for their own reform program. For example, in the telecommunication business, we experienced that telecommunication regulations from my country was invited in to share how can you develop 3G, 4G systems, have revenues back to the state. How do you do it? So from a completely locked down country with no external influence, they opened up. So what is the status now in 2020, just before these elections? What is the readiness to have this external input? Because my experience is that this is a country that could be very open, but it still has decades of being experienced with closed doors. So I think that the culture among these men and the sole woman who is at the ruling position, is that, you know, we can close the door again. We can be quite, you know, closing down. Or has the opening of the economy still open doors that can be used to be there to put pressure also on the political side? I would imagine that coming from the outside with ideas of electoral reform to reflect a federal system with minority protection could, on the merits, be very interesting. I mean, there could be good examples that could be put on the table. But is there a culture and an openness for that, or is it rather, you know, this is external interference? Let's close the door. We are proud. We have done this before. We hold the grip. I think that is a very important factor to understand before, you know, the West, the international community, whoever decides how to engage. So, you know, Richard sitting on the inside would be interesting to hear, and also from AA how she sees it.
Richard.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I agree with what you said earlier, Jonas, about, you know, we should not be turning back the clock 10 years, 20 years to the way that Myanmar was interacted with in the past. It didn't work. The failures of that period are manifest. Myanmar and the world's interests were neither of them solved by isolating Myanmar and making it poorer and denying it, you know, exposure to the world. But neither should we think that engagement and trade will automatically solve all of Myanmar's problems. The world today is also very different, of course. Myanmar can be much more reliant on the region than it ever could in the 1990s or the 2010s. It has geopolitical friends. It has a region that is generally supportive, and that allows it to turn away from the West if it chooses. But it doesn't want to. It doesn't want to be stuck in the embrace of China, a place which it struggled for years to get out of. It wants a counterbalance. The problem is that there isn't really a political psychology in Naypyidaw of horse trading, of negotiation, of concessions that can enable the country, you know, to negotiate a path out of this. And that's really the problem. There's a mentality which seems a little bit stuck in, you know, sticking to its guns, refusing to concede, and you know, continuing down the path that it had defined for itself. And that makes it very difficult for the outside world. But I think what the outside world shouldn't assume is either that isolation and sanctions will solve anything, they will only make it worse, or that engagement will automatically mean that the West is capitulating on its principles, on the changes that it wants to see. What we need here is an accurate theory of change, a realistic theory of change. Sanctions is not a theory of change. It may be virtue signaling, it may be a principled stance. It's not a theory of change. Myanmar doesn't respond to pressure. That's just the way things are. You know, the sanctions of the past prove that. It's going to be a long, tough process of drawing Myanmar out into the world, changing that political psychology in Naypyidaw. It's not going to be a process of horse trading or concessions or carrot and stick diplomacy, and definitely not change through sanctions.
Right, thank you. Ei, your thoughts on that and what the international community could and should do?
I think we need more so engagement with the political international community, because I think sanction is not the right choice. So to improve Myanmar to move forward to the democratic country, because we now so under pressure regarding to the Rohingya issue. So I think so this issue could be has some of the barriers to improve how can I say, to improve that, so I think that is not the best way, because we are, I think government, so they are busy with handling that kind of issue rather than moving forward for other issues that need to be addressed in Myanmar.
Right, thank you. Jonas, I don't know if you have some more thoughts on how to respond in the ways you were talking about after the election, but we've got a question here from Stefano Fantaroni at the European External Action Service. saying that while it's very clear, as Richard said, that these elections will not be perfect, they could be quite democratic given the standards in the region, despite the shortcomings. But already some NGOs, probably a growing number, are calling for non-recognition of the results and the new government if, I suppose, the outcome is too egregious or too many people are disenfranchised. What would, for example, Crisis Group recommend for how the international community reacts to the results of the election? I know that you said personally you believe in engagement. I presume for Norway, are you saying for the entire international community?
Well, I mean, the international community is not one body, and I think Richard clearly described that. There is an option for Myanmar to turn away from democracies and engage with the region, but I think Richard is absolutely right. It is not in Myanmar's interest for two reasons. One is that they would seek a broader network. There is culture and tradition in this country also for leaning in that direction. And secondly, it will not solve Myanmar's problems. It will increase its dependence on neighbors. And these are neighbors who don't care about constitutions and elections and these values. So, I mean, that's not a lane to go down. I would...
Hello, I think we've got...
Am I on? Yeah. So, I would argue that still a policy of engagement, but it has to be principled. I think, the European Union and its External Action Service and countries like Norway should not shy away from pointing out deficiencies, violations, and be very firm on that. But again, I think, going down the road of not recognizing the election result, closing the doors, is simply not going to help the purposes we are trying to achieve. I think we have to acknowledge that this is a country, again, as I said from the introduction, and I would say that I say this from a distance, and I feel, you who live in the middle of it have, a different experience, but from a distance, we have to see the historic perspective. We may be, opening up a new chapter where Myanmar is not closed, where it is not locked down, where it is not hovering around in its own contradictions. So what I would, kind of favor would be a structured dialogue with an organized kind of agenda of points where the international community can play a constructive role. There should be some carrots and sticks involved, but this is not, as Richard said, hard bargaining. This is not about, if you don't do this, we will cut off that. Right. I think it is much more subtle than that, but it is one of the big tasks. And I think, a lot is at stake in the region to see Myanmar gradually succeed coming out of where it is right now.
Right, I see. Thank you very much. We have actually, this is I think a reasonable point. Alex Harmet Sievers of the Heinrich Böll Foundation, Yangon, says, we've already heard election cancellations are likely to reduce ethnic representative share of parliamentary seats, but wouldn't this automatically strengthen also the relative share of military representatives in parliament beyond the 25% they have anyway? Even if you're only talking 22 seats, I guess it does, the math. Or are these going to be filled by-elections in subsequent months?
So yes, it does mean that the military will have a slightly higher percentage, I don't know, 26, a little bit less than 26%. Any seats that are cancelled, any seats that are empty, can be filled in a future by-election. The earliest a by-election can be is early 2022, because there is a law that no by-elections can be held within the first year. So early 2022, yes, if the situation has improved. It's hard to see the situation on the ground in Rakhine getting dramatically better in a year, especially after what's just happened. But of course, a different standard could be applied. So we could see these being filled through by-elections in the future. Right. It's possible.
Right. So meanwhile, the military will get a slight, even extra edge, but they hardly need it, I think. Just a question here from Thompson Chow, Chief Reporter of Myanmar Times, which I think is a very timely question. We haven't really discussed the impact of COVID-19 on the economy. It's disrupted key industries in Myanmar and put millions of jobs and livelihoods at risk. Why hasn't this economic damage translated into an economy-focused campaign season and compelled political parties to shift from security and constitution towards issues like inequality and welfare state? And I must say, he's right that in a lot of the coverage I've read, very few people are talking about the economy, but I've seen some dire surveys that the majority of households in Yangon don't have enough food to eat. One would think that that's a condition for a near revolution, but not in Myanmar, I guess. Ei, do you have thoughts on that? Why isn't economy playing bigger in the election?
Can I skip to this question because I'm not good at talking about the economic issue?
Well, certainly, I guess you might have been looking at the election coverage campaigns, though. Richard, I know you are.
Yes, I mean, in one sense, the economy and the COVID crisis is definitely impinging on the election campaign. There's been a couple of election rallies going past my window in the last 2 days, handing out food to voters who come out of our houses to take them off a party truck. So there's definitely that kind of economy at play. But you're right. I mean, if you look at the GDP figures and the projections that the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and others have made, Myanmar is not in the worst situation in the region because it has a lower reliance on trade and tourism than some other countries. But I don't think that accurately reflects the lived reality of Myanmar people, because the Myanmar government has spent far less money on stimulus and on protecting the livelihoods of the poorest. The channels for doing that are antiquated. They're not very sophisticated. The government isn't able to push out large amounts of money directly to people. And so for the average poor family, there is no safety net. There is no government safety net. The social safety nets of the monasteries and religious institutions and society are breaking down because everyone is in the same boat. And the poorest are particularly hard hit by lockdowns and stay-at-home orders. So for what I see, even on the streets outside my apartment in downtown Yangon, is real signs of problems. Why hasn't that become an electoral issue? Simply because there is no opposition party presenting a different vision or challenging the government. The national opposition, the military established USDP, is in disarray. It's waving flags, but it's not pushing the government. There is no national dialogue on this and no challenges from the political opposition.
It's very interesting. I mean, even in Thailand, which is absolutely engulfed now in, as we all know, in student protests, the economy is not an issue really dominating the podium. But underneath that, I mean, there are staggering figures, like more than 2/3 of the 520,000 new graduates graduating this month and next month do not have a clear idea of their job. That kind of thing is obviously fueling unrest. So I think that question was really aimed at, clearly if the situation goes on with Myanmar and there's a meltdown of job market and people with not enough to eat, I think it does seem a bit inevitable that there'd be some more backlash, but extraordinary that it's not playing out in the election campaign.
Yeah, and I think just because it hasn't come out as an electoral issue ahead of the vote does not mean it is not a very live political issue. This is going to transform politics and society in the coming years in this country, as it will in many other countries.
Right, thank you. Jonas, you have your hand
up. I'd just like to add my voice to that. And this is a general issue in all countries, from Myanmar to my country, Norway. We are focusing on the spread of COVID. We are counting the numbers of infected and casualties, but there is far less focus on what will be the long-term economic and social consequences, which is harder science, much more difficult. But now that countries experience a second wave of contamination, I'm also deeply concerned about the second wave of the economic and social lockdown, and it's of course hurting poor countries much harder. And I think it's interesting for the Myanmar case that a military party and a military setup, they don't have the instincts really in their institutional setup to be concerned about this. And this is one of the major weaknesses of this constitution, that you have such a key element of the parliamentary setup. I mean, what is a parliament good for? It is there to to pull in impressions from all part of the fabric of society and try to translate that into political solutions that will improve daily life of people. But with this setup of the military, they can block that. I think that is a real challenge and should be, part of what the international community should communicate to Myanmar, that believing that having that blocking position in parliament is something that is providing stability over time. It may be the contrary. Right.
Thank you. We've got time for one more question, or if I'm told that we can extend by a minute, maybe two. This comes from Marcus Brand, the International IDEA Head of Mission in Myanmar. He says, there is scope for electoral reform within the scope of the Constitution. It won't happen because of pressure from the outside, however. How could a coalition of stakeholders in Myanmar be built after the election to address such reform? For example, issues like the Union Election Commission independence, decision-making processes, malapportionment of constituencies, etc. Do you think a coalition of stakeholders like that is possible? E, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it could not be possible. Yeah.
Oh, right. That's bleak.
Yeah, it's impossible because so within 5 years, so and indeed they trying to change the constitution, but because of the military participation in the parliament, so it cannot be changed the constitution, and also I think we cannot change the constitution. It cannot be it cannot be an independent election, and so we have to face that kind of issue every 5 years.
Right.
So that because of so many things happening there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Richard, do you think there's potential for building a coalition of such stakeholders?
I mean, some of the most problematic aspects of the electoral system are baked into the Constitution. So first past the post isn't explicitly mentioned, but the Constitutional Tribunal has ruled that changing that would require constitutional change. Malapportionment is mostly baked into the Constitution. Things like the Electoral Commission. The president has the power to appoint the Electoral Commission for a term the same as the president. That almost guarantees a non-independent Electoral Commission. But the president doesn't have to, skew this in the most non-independent way. It is within the gift of the president to choose who those people are. The current Election Commission is 15 75-year-old men. 13 of them are Burma Buddhist. That is not a representation which gives credibility, independence, or diversity, and it does not reflect the country. That is completely within the gift of the president. And I think next February, when it is time to appoint a new election commission, that is the time to be giving ideas, support, advice. Organizations like IDEA and others who are involved in this field, choose a more diverse representative body. It's also good for the NLD not to be blamed for all the mistakes that an electoral commission may end up making.
Right, but it's the government it's the elected government that has the final say on the makeup of that commission, right?
It is the president, yes, but the president can choose wisely.
And they can form a stakeholder coalition. They know who to lobby. Just a couple more. One from David Cameron at Sciences Po in Paris. He says, as Richard indicated, given the archaic first past the post electoral system, strong parties are required to compete. What are the main factors? This is a very good question, I think. What are the main factors prohibiting the all these ethnic minority parties from forming an umbrella party? I mean, I think we've been there before, and many discussions on how they've split their own votes. Could it be different this time? E, do you have any thoughts on the potential for all these little ethnic groups? Why don't they band together and form an umbrella party?
I think we already explained about that. I think it could be impossible if we cannot change the electoral system. Yeah.
Right. Okay. And Richard, any thought?
Yeah, I mean, one problem is even if they did form this grand coalition, they would have 11% of the seats under the current system. So it wouldn't bring them much more than just having separate representation.
Right.
The ethnic areas are 25% of the electorate. It's not big enough to form, a decisive power bloc.
No.
But the other thing is, why should we expect the parties and the communities from hugely diverse ethnic groups to all agree on a single set of objectives? That is pushing Myanmar further down the path of identity politics, and that's what it needs to escape from. It needs policy politics. It needs national parties that can represent everyone. There isn't a party of the left and a party of the right in Myanmar. There's a party of Aung San Suu Kyi and there's a party of the old military regime, and that's what you have. Policy politics needs to emerge, and obviously that will take a long time. It's a young democracy.
Sure.
These things will take
I
time.
think that question, though, could be particularly relevant to the biggest, the Shan state, where that you've got a very, very powerful and big variety of ethnic groups who nearly did, and actually at one point did, have an alliance that kind of fell apart. There is a question also on that particular Shan state example from Frank Follner, UNDP, Senior Parliamentary Advisor in Indonesia, who does ask that regarding Shan state, for example, the Shan state parliament situation, do you foresee Shan Nationalities League for Democracy losing its small majority over the NLD, or maybe getting even stronger? I mean, I think Shan politics are possibly in a slightly different category. Am I right?
Yeah. Was that to me, Gwen? I think Shan State is always hard to predict. It has huge diversity. Some of these seats have been partially cancelled. We don't know what the effect of partial cancellations will mean in terms of which parties win. But in general, I think there will be less Shan people voting for the NLD and more Shan people voting for the SNLD, the Shan party. But it's a first past the post system. It's clustered constituencies. It may not dramatically change the seat count.
Right, I see. Thank you. And maybe a final one on the Rohingya issue from Hunter Marson, PhD researcher from Australian National University, and sometimes author of op-eds. The Union Election Commission has disqualified a number of Rohingya and other candidates on grounds of inability to prove citizenship. Are there any Rohingya still running in the election? And additionally, but I think we've answered this, what potential is there for ethnic representation in the next parliament to reduce ethnic and or religious tensions? Perhaps, I don't know, Ei, are you aware of any Rohingya candidates running, or are they all out?
I think some of the Rohingya candidates, they are running. Yeah, they are running.
Right. We have Rohingya candidates.
Yeah, they are running. Yes.
There's a couple outside of Rakhine State, but all of the Rohingya candidates in Rakhine State were blocked on spurious grounds. They had the papers needed to prove what needed to be proved. It was a discriminatory move to bar them from the election. The same thing happened in 2015. So no Rohingya competing for seats in Rakhine State, but just a couple outside. Right,
but not presumably representing a Rohingya party.
Yes, representing a Rohingya party. There are three Rohingya parties still with candidates in the race.
Right, who presumably have been able to prove that they are eligible.
Yes, they don't have Rohingya in the name of the party. It's not an accepted word that can be used in a registered party name. But there are a number of Rohingya citizens, including people whose parents were quite prominent in earlier eras in Myanmar.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think that's been a really great sweep of questions and fantastic insights. I just wonder, Jonas, do you have anything you would like to leave us with? Because
just one word from the greatest distance right now. I would say that you said, Gwen, that this is a young democracy, but I would say it's a young democracy with very old people in the leadership. And the demography is going to change that in a few years. So I think one area where the international community should engage is with young people. And this may seem a bit like a summer camp, and it's hard work. But I believe keeping that transparency, the openness, addressing universities, having open doors, is still a contribution to what I would say would be future change. So in countries like this, including the United States, I would say old people are replaced with old people. But still, you know, gradually there will be young people coming on, and I think that's an area where we should, as an international community, put a lot of attention.
Yeah,
that's a hopeful note.
I think that advice and insight would resonate in Thailand too, where I am, indeed.
Yes.
And lastly, do either of you have some specific point you'd like to leave us with? I could. You okay? Well, I'd just like to thank everybody for viewing, and some great questions, and really sorry we couldn't get to them, but hopefully there will be a few more events before the election and a lot to talk about afterwards. Maybe we should persuade this panel to do it again at some point. Anyway, thank you very much all, and I think you can review the Facebook video, I think. Anyway, thank you again, and goodbye. Good luck.
Thanks, everyone.